He could have woken her. That is the part she kept coming back to. Afterward, in the weeks that followed, during meetings she was supposed to be running, and dinners she was supposed to be present for, and late nights alone in her apartment staring at the ceiling. He could have shifted his weight. He could have cleared his throat. He could have nudged her shoulder the way a stranger does on a plane when boundaries have been accidentally crossed and everyone pretends it did not happen. Instead, for 3 hours and 11 minutes, the man in seat 14B did not move. Before we find out why that mattered more than anything anyone had ever said to her, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story travels. And if you have ever stayed perfectly still for someone who needed the rest more than you needed your comfort, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is for you. The flight was the last one out of O'Hare on a Thursday night in January, delayed twice, boarding at 11:40. The kind of flight nobody takes by choice. Jalen Cross was in 14B, because 14B was the cheapest seat available when he booked it 6 hours earlier, and because the consulting firm where he worked as a facilities engineer had a travel budget that did not extend to legroom. He had spent the day in a freezing mechanical room diagnosing a ventilation failure that 3 previous contractors had misidentified, and he was tired in the specific way that only comes from solving a problem nobody else could solve, and receiving no recognition for it, because the people who benefited from the solution had no idea it had been a problem in the first place. That morning, before the airport, before the mechanical room, before any of it, he had been in a kitchen in Charlotte making oatmeal for his daughter Bria, who was 7 and had spent the entire breakfast explaining to him, with visual aids drawn on a napkin, why the solar system needed a 10th planet, and why she should be the one to name it. "What would you name it?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice weighing precedent. "Bria," she said. Obviously, she had her mother's confidence and her father's patience, which was a combination that made her, at 7, one of the most formidable people he had ever met. Her mother, Simone, had been an architect, the kind who believed buildings should feel like the people who lived in them, and she had died 3 years ago in a way that Jalen still could not talk about without his hands going still. Which is what hands do when they are trying not to shake. He carried a small brass compass in his jacket pocket. It had been hers. She used to take it to job sites because she said the best buildings started with knowing exactly where you stood. Bria had given it to him the week after the funeral, not because she understood what it meant, but because she understood that her father needed to hold something, and the compass was the right weight. He kissed the top of her head, dropped her at Miss Lorraine's for the night, and drove to the airport with the compass in his pocket and the particular tiredness of a man who had been the only adult in his daughter's life for 3 years and had not once let her see him falter. Vivienne Ashford was in 14A because the universe has a sense of humor that corporate travel policies cannot override. She was the chief executive of Ashford Structural, a $200 million engineering firm she had built from a single drafting table in her mother's basement, and she was supposed to be in first class, and first class was oversold, and by the time she reached the gate, the only seat left on the last flight to Charlotte was a window seat in row 14 beside a man in a work jacket who was already asleep before the doors closed. She was not the kind of woman who slept on planes. She was not the kind of woman who slept much at all. She ran her company with a precision that left no room for rest, because rest required trust, and trust required believing that things would still be standing when she opened her eyes, and she had spent 38 years learning that they usually were not. The day had been long in the specific way that days are long when they contain a board meeting that questioned her judgment, a call from an investor who used the word concerned the way doctors use the word, discomfort. And a dinner she had attended alone because the man she had been seeing for 4 months had cancelled an hour before with a text that said something had come up, which she understood to mean that something better had come up, which she understood to mean that she was not the something. She sat in 14A and told herself she would work through the flight. She opened her laptop. She read the same paragraph of a feasibility report 4 times. Then, the plane took off, and the lights dimmed, and the engines settled into that low, constant hum that does something to the human nervous system that no amount of discipline can override, and somewhere over Kentucky, her body made a decision her mind would never have authorized. Her head dropped. Slowly, the way a glass tips when nobody catches it in time. First forward, then, when the angle became unsustainable, sideways, toward the shoulder of the man in 14B. Jalen felt it land. The specific weight of a head that was not his daughter's, settling against his left shoulder with the unguarded heaviness of someone who had fallen asleep so completely that their body had chosen the nearest solid thing and committed to it without consultation. He looked down, dark hair against his jacket. The faint smell of expensive shampoo mixing with the industrial soap he had not had time to wash off properly. The slow, even breathing of a woman who had clearly not rested in a very long time. He could have moved. He considered it. He was a practical man, and this was a professional complication he did not need. A stranger asleep on his shoulder on a plane where anyone could see and interpret and conclude. But something about the quality of her breathing, the particular depth of it, the way her hand had gone limp against the armrest, as though every muscle in her body had simultaneously agreed to stop performing, told him that this woman was not merely tired. She was the kind of tired that accumulates over years, the kind that shows up one night on a delayed flight and simply refuses to wait any longer. So, he did not move. He adjusted his weight just enough to keep her head from slipping. He folded his hands in his lap. And he sat there, completely still, for 3 hours and 11 minutes, watching the flight tracker move slowly across the screen, while a woman he had never met slept against him like he was the safest place she had found in a long time. 40 minutes in, a flight attendant named Rosa paused in the aisle. She looked at the two of them. She looked at Jalen's face, which was calm and alert, and showed no sign of distress, only the quiet patience of a man who had decided this was where he was supposed to be right now. She disappeared and came back with a thin airline blanket, and without saying a word, she draped it over both of them, tucking the edge gently around the sleeping woman's shoulders. Jalen looked up at her. Rosa smiled the way women smile when they recognize something they have seen before, one person holding still for another, and she walked away without a word. The blanket stayed for the rest of the flight. And Jalen sat beneath it with a stranger's head on his shoulder and thought about Bria, and about Simone, and about how the last time anyone had fallen asleep against him with that kind of trust. It had been his wife, in a hospital bed, the night before she stopped waking up. He did not cry. He just sat there. And the plane moved through the dark. She woke up 6 minutes before landing. The shift was small, a breath that changed rhythm, a muscle in her neck that tightened, and then the sudden full-body awareness of someone who has just realized where they are and who they are leaning against, and how long it has been. She sat up fast. Her hand went to her hair. Her eyes went wide. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. How long was I?" Jalen looked at her. "A while," he said. "Why did you not wake me?" He considered the question with the same care he brought to everything. "You looked like you needed the sleep more than I needed my shoulder." The sentence landed somewhere Vivienne was not expecting. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the blanket, which she had not noticed until now, draped over both of them, and something behind her expression shifted in the way things shift when a person has been holding themselves together for so long that a single act of unexpected gentleness finds the seam. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of strangers on airplanes. But her jaw tightened in a way that told Jalen she was working very hard not to, and he pretended not to notice, because some things are better left unwitnessed. The plane landed. The seatbelt sign went off. 200 people stood up at once the way they always do, as if the door might close again if they did not hurry. Jalen waited. Vivienne waited, because she could not stand yet. Her legs felt strange, the way legs feel when the body has rested for the first time in years and is briefly confused about how standing works. He pulled her bag from the overhead without being asked. He set it in the aisle. He did not give her his number. He did not ask for hers. He said, "I hope you sleep that well tonight," and he walked off the plane, and she stood in row 14 holding her bag and a thin airline blanket she had not meant to take and could not bring herself to leave. She took the blanket home. She folded it and put it on the chair beside her bed. She did not sleep that well that night, or any night that week, but she tried. And every time she closed her eyes, the thing she kept returning to was not the embarrassment of falling asleep on a stranger. It was the fact that he had stayed 3 hours. Without moving. Without asking for anything. Without making it about himself. And the last time anyone had done anything even remotely like that for her, she could not remember, which meant it had either been too long ago to recall or it had never happened at all. She found him 11 days later, which is both a long time and no time at all when you are the chief executive of a $200 million company trying to locate a man whose name you do not know from a middle seat on a delayed flight. She had tried the airline first. Passenger manifests were not available to the public. She had tried the gate agent, who remembered nothing. She had tried to describe him to her assistant Clara, and had gotten as far as tall, broad shoulders, work jacket, very still. At which point Clara had looked at her with the particular expression assistants reserve for the moment they realize their boss is not talking about a business contact. What finally found him was not technology or corporate resources or any of the tools a woman in her position would normally deploy. It was the logo on his jacket. She had stared at it for 3 hours while pretending to be asleep for the last 40 minutes of the flight. Because she had woken up somewhere over Tennessee and chosen not to move. Because moving would have meant admitting she was awake, and admitting she was awake would have meant lifting her head, and lifting her head would have meant losing the only peace she had felt in months. The logo said Mercer Consulting Group, a facilities engineering firm in Charlotte. She called. She asked for the engineer who had been in Chicago on Thursday. The receptionist said, "Oh, you mean Jalen." Everybody asks for Jalen. He is that kind of person. She hung up before the call could be transferred, because she had not planned what to say, and because hearing his name for the first time, Jalen, landing in her ear like something she had been waiting to learn, made her hands shake in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a feeling she had been so busy she had forgotten existed. The problem, which she identified with the same analytical clarity she brought to every other problem in her professional life, was that he worked in the building she had just hired his firm to service. Ashford Structural's Charlotte headquarters occupied floors 12 through 18 of the Ridgeline Tower, and the mechanical systems contract had been awarded to Mercer Consulting Group 6 months earlier, which meant that the man whose shoulder she had slept on for 3 hours was now, technically, a contractor working in her building. She saw him for the first time on a Tuesday morning. He was in the lobby, kneeling beside an access panel with a multimeter in one hand and a work order in the other, completely absorbed. She was walking toward the elevator with her coffee and a phone call she was pretending to be on so that nobody would talk to her before 9. She stopped walking. He looked up. Their eyes met across 40 feet of marble lobby, and the recognition was instant and total and accompanied by a silence so specific that Clara, walking 3 steps behind, later described it as the loudest quiet she had ever heard. Neither of them spoke. Jalen nodded once. Vivienne nodded once. Then, she kept walking, and he went back to the panel. Clara, walking behind her, said nothing until they were inside the elevator. Then she said, very quietly, "You stopped breathing for a second." Vivienne said, "I know." And both of them spent the rest of the day thinking about absolutely nothing else. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in 2 adults pretending they were not thinking about each other while everyone around them slowly figured it out. They passed each other in corridors. They shared elevators in silences that lasted 14 floors and contained more information than most conversations. They developed an unspoken geography of the building, knowing instinctively which stairwell the other preferred, which floor the other serviced at which hour, which corridor to avoid if they did not trust themselves to pass without stopping, and which corridor to take if they did. Jalen, for his part, handled it the way he handled most things, by working. He arrived early, stayed late, serviced every unit on his schedule with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and told himself that the woman on the 12th floor was a client and the 3 hours on the plane were a thing that happened and the compass in his pocket did not point toward people, and he needed to stop thinking about the smell of expensive shampoo mixing with industrial soap. Bria, as always, saw through him within a week. "Dad, you are doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend you are reading but you are staring at the same page." He looked down. Page 47. He had been on page 47 for 20 minutes. Bria was sitting across the kitchen table with a plate of pasta and the expression of a child who had made a diagnosis and was waiting for the patient to accept it. "Is it the shoulder lady?" she asked. He stared at her. "How do you know about the shoulder lady?" "You talked in your sleep. You said sorry I did not move." He closed the book. Bria went back to her pasta with the satisfied air of someone who had proven a hypothesis, and Jalen sat there thinking that his 7-year-old daughter had just dismantled his emotional defenses with the precision of a structural engineer, which was fitting, because that was exactly what her mother had been. The moment that cracked everything open happened in the mechanical room on the 14th floor at 8:40 on a Wednesday evening. Vivienne had come down to check on a heating complaint from the partners' conference room, not because it was her job, but because the 14th floor was where Jalen's service schedule put him on Wednesdays. And she had learned his schedule the way she learned financial models, thoroughly and with more personal interest than the task required. He was inside the HVAC housing, forearms deep in ductwork, and he did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway and watched him work the way she had watched him on the plane, with the quiet attention of someone studying something they wanted to understand. And the thing she wanted to understand had nothing to do with ventilation. He backed out of the housing, turned, and found her standing 4 feet away in a tailored suit with her arms crossed and her composure arranged in a way that suggested it had taken effort. "The heating on this floor has been intermittent," she said, which was true and completely beside the point, and they both knew it. "I am looking at it now," he said, which was also true and also completely beside the point. They stood there, 4 feet apart. The mechanical room hummed around them. Neither of them moved. Then she said, "I took the blanket." He blinked. "From the plane." "I still have it." She paused. On the chair, beside my bed. The sentence sat in the mechanical room like a small explosion, quiet and devastating, because it was not about a blanket. It was about a woman who had kept a thin airline blanket on her bedroom chair for 3 weeks, because it was the closest thing she had to the feeling of being held without being asked to perform something in return. Jalen looked at her. He looked at the ductwork behind him. He looked at the 4 feet of floor between them and thought about every reason he should not cross it and could not find one that was strong enough. He did not cross it. Not yet. Instead, he said, I kept thinking about it too. The flight. And he watched her expression change the way a skyline changes at dawn, not all at once, but unmistakably, every light going on in sequence. Thank you, she said, for not moving. He nodded once. You were tired, he said. Somebody should have noticed before me. They stood there a moment longer. Then the building system beeped, a timer resetting, something ordinary, and the spell did not break exactly, but it softened enough for both of them to step back into the versions of themselves the building expected, and she went back upstairs, and he went back to the ductwork, and both of them understood that whatever had been building since the plane had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The building's facilities director, a man named Grant Paulson, who had spent 20 years managing contractors and had never once had to manage a situation where a contractor and the chief executive were orbiting each other like 2 planets that had forgotten how gravity worked, pulled Jalen aside the following Monday. There has been a question raised, Grant said carefully, about the frequency of your service visits to the executive floors. Jalen looked at him. My service visits are on the schedule your office approved. Grant nodded slowly. I know. I am just telling you that someone noticed, and in this building, when someone notices something about the CEO, it becomes a conversation that does not stay small. Jalen understood. The someone was almost certainly Marcus Webb, Ashford Structural's chief operating officer. A man who had been positioning himself as Vivienne's professional partner and personal interest for 2 years, with the kind of patience that only works when the other person is not paying attention. He had noticed, not the fac visits, but the change in Vivienne, the looseness, the distraction, the specific quality of a woman who was thinking about someone when she was supposed to be thinking about work, and he had begun, in the quiet, efficient way of corporate men, to identify the source. Jalen did not change his schedule. He did not avoid the executive floors. He did his job the way he had always done it, competently and without performance, and he let the building think whatever the building wanted to think. But he went home that night and sat in Bria's room after she fell asleep, holding the brass compass in his hand, and thought about what it cost a man in his position to want something that the world had already decided was not meant for someone who entered through the service door. The shift happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after the mechanical room. Vivienne was presenting to the full board, 12 people, when the HVAC system on the executive floor failed completely. Not a gradual decline. A full shutdown, temperature dropping fast, the boardroom turning cold enough that breath became visible within 20 minutes. Jalen was paged. He came up through the service stairs and walked into the boardroom because that was where the thermostat panel was, and for 30 seconds he was on his knees beside the wall with a panel, open while the board watched and Vivienne stood at the head of the table, and their eyes met across a room full of people who were cold and irritated and had no idea that the woman running the meeting and the man on the floor fixing the heating had not been able to stop thinking about each other for a month. He fixed it in 4 minutes. He stood, nodded once at the room, and left. Marcus Webb watched him go with the focused attention of a man revising his understanding of a situation. That evening, Marcus submitted a formal recommendation to replace Mercer Consulting Group with a competing firm. The stated reason was service response times. The real reason was a man on his knees in a boardroom who had looked at the CEO the way Marcus wanted to be looked at and never had been. Vivienne read the recommendation on Saturday morning. She read it twice. Then, she called a board meeting for Monday and did something she had never done in 9 years of running her company. She made a personal decision in a professional room. She told the board that the facilities contract would remain with Mercer Consulting Group because their engineer had maintained the building's systems with a level of care and competence that exceeded every metric the company tracked. She presented the service logs, the response times, the maintenance records. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. And then she looked directly at Marcus and said, "If anyone in this room has a concern about the contractor that is not reflected in this data, I would like to hear it now, in front of everyone, so we can address it properly." Marcus said nothing. The recommendation was withdrawn before lunch. He transferred to the Seattle office within the month, not because he was asked to, but because he understood, in the way ambitious men eventually understand, that the thing he wanted was not available and never had been. Months passed the way months do when something important is growing and neither person is willing to rush it. They did not date. That is not quite the right word for what they did. They existed in the same building with an awareness of each other so constant and so carefully managed that it became its own kind of intimacy. He knew which days she skipped lunch. She knew which weeks his daughter had a school project, because his sleeves would have small paint or glue marks that he did not bother hiding. They spoke more now, in corridors, in elevators, in the mechanical room that had become their private geography, and the conversations were longer and less careful and covered territory that had nothing to do with the building's systems. He told her about Simone. The way she held blueprints like love letters, the way the compass in his pocket still pointed to her some days and to the future on others, the way Bria had her mother's stubborn precision and his own quiet endurance. She told him about the years since her last real relationship, a marriage that ended so quietly she was not sure either of them had noticed until the lease was up. She told him about the investor who used the word concerned, about the text that said something had come up, about the specific exhaustion of being admired by 300 people and known by none of them. One Friday evening, he brought Bria to the building because Miss Lorraine was visiting her sister, and there was no one else. Bria sat in the lobby with a sketchbook and drew the elevator doors with the seriousness of a person documenting important infrastructure. Vivienne came down at 6, and Bria looked up at her and said, "You are the shoulder lady." The lobby went quiet. Jalen, standing 15 feet away with a tool belt he suddenly had no idea what to do with, watched his daughter deliver the most devastatingly accurate introduction of his life. Vivienne crouched down. She looked at Bria. "Hello," she said. "I am Vivienne." "I know," Bria said. "My dad talks in his sleep about you." She paused. He said, "Sorry, I did not move." Vivienne's composure broke. Not visibly, not in a way anyone except Jalen would have recognized, but he saw it, the way something behind her eyes went from held to released, and she laughed. The real laugh, the one he had never heard before, and would spend the rest of his life trying to hear again. Bria studied her for a moment with the evaluating intensity of a child who has decided this interaction matters. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass compass and held it out. "This was my mom's," she said. "She used it to find where she was going. My dad carries it, but I think you need it today." Vivienne looked at the compass in the small outstretched hand. She looked at Jalen. She looked at the 7-year-old who had just handed her the most important object in their family with the confident generosity of a child who understood, better than any adult in the room, that some things are meant to be shared. She took it. She held it in her palm. And something that had been circling for weeks finally came to rest. That night, after Bria fell asleep on the couch in Vivian's office wrapped in the airline blanket that had somehow migrated from Vivian's apartment to her desk drawer to this exact moment, Jalen and Vivian stood in the hallway outside her door. "I should take her home," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved. The building was empty. The city was quiet. The only light came from her office, where a 7-year-old girl was sleeping under a blanket that had once covered 2 strangers on a plane, holding a compass that had belonged to a woman she barely remembered but whose presence she carried in everything she did. Vivian reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket. A small adjustment, the kind that takes about 3 seconds and means nothing, except when it means everything. "I have a question," she said. "Okay, on the plane. When I fell asleep." She paused. "Did you think about waking me?" "Every minute," he said. "Why did you not?" "Because you were breathing like someone who had forgotten how," he said. "And I wanted to see if you would remember." She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she has decided to trust, not with the careful calculation of a chief executive evaluating risk, but with the open, unguarded attention of someone who has stopped performing and is simply present, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, including blueprints, including sunsets, including his daughter's drawings of elevator doors. "I remember now," she said. He smiled. The real one. The one Bria said made his whole face change. "Good," he said. "Then I will see you Monday." He picked up Bria without waking her, blanket and all, and carried her to the car, and Vivian stood in the hallway and watched them go, and did not close her office door for a long time, because closing it would have meant the evening was over, and she was not ready for that. On the chair beside her bed at home, the airline blanket was gone, because it was currently wrapped around a sleeping child in the back of a car driving through the quiet streets of Charlotte. She would get it back. Eventually, or maybe she would not. Maybe it would live in Bria's room now, added to the small collection of objects that carry people better than memory does. In the front seat, the brass compass sat in the cup holder where Bria had placed it before falling asleep, pointing south, which was the direction of home. Which was the direction of everything that mattered. So let me ask you something tonight. Has someone ever stayed perfectly still for you, not because they had to, but because they understood that your rest was worth more than their comfort? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. New stories every week.